Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve. Did I mention we're on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy? There's so many benefits to joining us on Patreon. You get included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. You get bonus audio, video content, Pope coin, monthly book drawings, early content, and ad-free content. Sign up early so that you have your name on the top of the list. And really, for as little as 10 cents a day US, you can join the list if you want to be on the tops of the list. It's 50 cents a day. Your donations and your support on Patreon go a long, long way to helping me keep this whole podcasting scheme going. It definitely helps keep the lights on at the History of the Papacy. And I definitely encourage you to go over there and at least think about becoming a patron, because it would be very much appreciated. But there's many other ways to support the show. You could buy a material on my Amazon wish list. You can send in a comment or feedback to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. You can listen to the episodes and maybe tell a friend or two about them. Maybe spread it around on your social media. Press that share button. Also, leaving ratings and reviews on iTunes, Apple Podcasts are super helpful. Everything's appreciated. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah. At Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. Today, we are joined again for part 2 of our conversation with Professor David L. Eastman to continue talking about the history of Christianity in North Africa. Professor Eastman is the author of Early North African Christianity, Turning Points in the Development of the Church. We will look at how persecutions, plagues, differences in class and ethnicity, along with arguments about the fundamentals of the value and the position of the hierarchy of the church, rocked not only the African church, but all of Latin Christianity. This is our second conversation with Professor Eastman, but you really don't have to necessarily listen to them in order. They really are our last conversation and this one standalone, but you always could go back and listen to that one or tell a friend about it. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy. I am very happy to be joined again by Professor David L. Eastman today to discuss early Christianity in North Africa. Professor Eastman is the author of the newly released Early North African Christianity, Turning Points in the Development of the Church. And this is part 2 of a 2-part conversation. You can go back and listen to the first part where we talk about Tertullian, Perpetua, and Felicity and discuss the background of Christianity in North Africa, or just start here and work backwards, whatever works best for you. Now, Professor Eastman is the Joseph Glenn Sherrill Chair of Bible at the Macabre School. He is an adjunct fellow at the University of Regensburg, Germany, and a fellow with the Center of Early African Christianity. He is also an author of numerous books and articles and has a PhD from Yale University. Now, just to set it up a little bit, I was introduced to Professor Eastman through Dr. James Papandrea, and I'm thankful he did make this connection because I'm fascinated with the North African Church, and I'm definitely looking forward to talking about it more. Now, in the last episode, we talked about some of the earliest Christians in North Africa. Today, David is going to guide us through some of the more important thinkers in the later phase of North African Christianity during the Roman Empire. Thank you so much for coming back on again.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Maybe just to set it up very briefly, what is the geographical and the time period we're going to be really focusing in today on?
Yeah, so today, if we're thinking about Cyprian, we're looking at the middle of the 3rd century and then heading through with Augustine into really the fourth and into the beginning of the fifth century. So we're looking at kind of a 2-century span overall. And we're still in what the Romans called Africa, which was what we might call North Africa. I call it North Africa in the book to clarify that it's not the entire continent. It's the Roman Africa, which is modern day parts of Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco as well. So Egypt was a separate province, and a place like Ethiopia, which is a very important early Christian center, was not a Roman province at all. So it didn't have a Roman name. But we're focusing really on the kind of the northern coast of Africa in large part, all the way over to Libya.
And this area more or less had a Latin culture, and it was more in the Western sphere than it was in the Eastern Greek sphere.
That's correct. Yeah. So there are, of course, the indigenous languages that were spoken in this region, but the educated language, or the language among the educated elites, and the official language would have been Latin for this area. And then there is this kind of cultural and linguistic line that separates Latin West from Greek-speaking East. And so Egypt fits into the Greek-speaking East. And if you look at that cultural line and the linguistic line, that is basically the great dividing line that the emperor Diocletian uses to divide the empire. When he divides the empire into actually 4 parts, 2 eastern parts and 2 western parts, the center line is basically this socio-linguistic line that between Latin speaking and Greek speaking, basically in a general sense. So
now we left off and we had talked about Tertullian and some of the other thinkers, and that's kind of the time period. Things are going pretty well with the Roman Empire. Now we enter with Cyprian of Carthage, and things are decidedly not going well. And this is the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. What was kind of going on in the Roman Empire, but even more specifically, how did that crisis affect North Africa and Carthage and Africa, Roman Africa?
Yeah, so the term "the crisis of the 3rd century" is a term used by Roman historians specifically and more broadly, and not just by historians of Christianity. It was an empire-wide crisis, and there were a number of factors. There were issues in the climate that led to some bad harvests. There was an ongoing war in the east with the Persians that was draining the coffers of the empire. You had disease. You had invasions in certain parts of the empire, especially the northern parts of the empire. So a lot of things are happening that put the traditional Roman heartland really in great distress. Also, in the midst of this, when all this is really beginning to go poorly, we also approach the traditional 1000th anniversary of Rome. There's a tradition that Rome was founded in 753 BCE. And so as you approach 247, you're coming up to the 1,000 years. And in the midst of that, a lot of nostalgia begins to appear, which is not uncommon around major holidays for different political units. And so people begin to say, wait a minute, what happened? Where did we go wrong? Look at the great glories of Rome in the past. What has happened? And this is where Roman religion plays a role in Roman politics. Roman religion, by its nature, was conservative, and I don't mean socially conservative. I mean it was conservative in the sense that don't change anything, because things have gone really well overall. So keep doing things the way we've done them. We talked about this, I think, a little bit last time, how that relates to persecution of Christians, where Christians do not worship the traditional Roman gods and goddesses. And in Roman religion, that's a threat. The gods may get angry. They may punish the empire. And so as things are going poorly for the empire, naturally, people begin to look around for scapegoats. And once again, Christians come to the top of the list. And so this period in the middle of the 3rd century is another fairly intense period of persecution for Christians. Not everywhere in the empire. These persecutions were all localized, but they got very intense. And certainly North Africa is impacted by this.
Now, one of the key figures during this time period is Cyprian of Carthage. What do we know about Cyprian?
Yeah, Cyprian drew the short straw as far as episcopal history goes. He comes onto the scene in Carthage, so in North Africa, in a period when there's tremendous pressure on the church because of everything going on. There's tremendous pressure on his people because there's famine and there's poverty. Lots of things are going wrong. And then in the midst of this, then there's also a plague. So Cyprian is dealing with multiple factors going on at the same time, multiple pressures being put on him and his community at the same time, both the general malaise of the Roman Empire at that time, but even more specifically, feeling the impact of the pressure being put upon Christians and the antagonism towards Christians at that time. where now here comes a plague. Well, why would the gods send a plague? Maybe it's the Christians. So this is where he steps onto the stage, not an enviable task at all.
No, so he's really is stepping into a major issue, and this is called the Plague of Cyprian. How does it get labeled with him?
Yes, not his fault. He didn't start it. It's often referred to as the Plague of Cyprian because it strikes North Africa at the time when he's the bishop. So he's the most important person of that time. And there also are indications that the Christians of Carthage were more actively involved in serving their community than the general population. While during this period, many people would retreat in times of plague and pestilence and pandemic, people tend to retreat. It would appear that Christians were one of those groups that was still reaching out to try to help those in need. So multiple reasons why he's associated with that particular period of history.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that aspect that the Christians were seen as both maybe causing the plague, but also they were seen as helping people during the plague. And I had read a book about by a sociologist named Rodney Stark, and he, using what limited number evidence we have of that time, he said that this is one of the times where Christianity really exploded. Do historians of this time period give Stark's book much prominence, or do they use it at all? Do they find importance in it, rather?
Yeah, it certainly is known that theory, and he specifically talks also about the role of women and the place of women in Christianity, which was also very countercultural. And perhaps that was one of the sociological factors that led to the growth of Christianity, was that in general, within Roman culture, women were looking around and saying, wait a minute, we're treated like property here. This is a group that's treating women differently with value. And that may have been a factor in attracting people to Christianity. And that may be. Stark is really trying to take, as you mentioned, a little bit of information and draw some longer term or some larger conclusions, I guess, which is always challenging. But it's plausible to think that when Christians are acting counterculturally in a positive way, the gospel may expand. That's a lot of what, at least what I was raised to believe, is that when everyone else is panicking, if we as Christians look different from the culture in a positive way, that will draw people to Christ. It's when I'm raised up, I will draw all men unto myself. It's the application of that concept from Jesus in times of controversy and need.
What was Cyprian's general outlook as a Christian, as a leader, besides these key events, because those really pushed him in a certain direction? But when going into being bishop, did he have a certain outlook?
He seems to have been, like many North Africans, more on the strict side of these issues as far as how Christians should respond. He has a work called The Exhortation to Martyrdom. So he seems to have a fairly clear view of how Christians should respond in the midst of persecution. Now, the irony for Cyprian is that early on in his time as bishop, he's during a period of persecution, he is convinced by his people to leave the city and basically to go into hiding, because they tell him, you're greater good to us in exile than you are dead. And so he goes into exile and then comes back. But the challenge arises as the persecution abates and slows down, is now you have people in the church who responded in different ways to the persecution. And now Cyprian has a pastoral issue of how to deal with his community.
What were some of the different ways that people tried to avoid? Well, first off, before we even talk about how they avoided persecution, what was the Romans actually wanting them to do?
Yeah, so it appears that the stipulation is you need to come to some kind of local official and offer some kind of sacrifice in honor of the emperor, which is therefore in honor of the Roman gods indirectly. And it seems to have been a fairly simple ceremony. You take some incense, you drop it in a fire, and you say, Caesar is Lord, or Hail Caesar, or something like that. It's different places give us different texts on this. And so this seems to be all that the Romans want. And with Roman religion, the thing that we need to always keep in mind is Roman religion was a religion of action, of deeds, what you do, not a religion of faith. So the Roman officials overseeing this don't really care if you believe that Caesar is Lord. They don't really care what you think about that. They just need you to do it and check a box and move on. But and so some Christians, so there are different responses. We have Christians apparently who did it, who went and offered the incense because there was the threat of incarceration and perhaps death. Some seem to have simply buckled under the pressure and just went and did it. And maybe they even kind of crossed their fingers and said, well, these Roman gods are not real gods anyway, so I'm not really doing anything. You have that option. Some Christians seem to have paid other people to offer the sacrifice for them, and then their name gets put down. Someone else pays your taxes for you, kind of thing. Some seem to have bribed local officials directly. So there was never actually a sacrifice at all. They just bribed the local official. And then there are those who refuse and are imprisoned or in some cases killed because they refuse to offer the incense. They refuse to offer the sacrifice. For that would be abandoning their faith.
And so after they would do this sacrifice that really to the Romans was perfunctory. It was just like filling out your taxes.
Yes.
You got a form, almost a passport, if you will.
It's a receipt, basically. The word is the labellus. It literally means a little book. It would be like a receipt, right? You go and you pay off a loan, and they give you a receipt, and you carry that with you, or you have it on your person. That's what they got. And so some of these are faked, some of these are purchased. So we know that there was a kind of a black market for these as well.
How often would somebody have to do that sacrifice in order to keep their libellus fresh?
Yeah, it seems that it happens under two different emperors. It seems to be kind of a one-time thing. It's not, as far as we know, you have to go back in 6 months or come back in a year, like going to the dentist. It was not that. It seems to be, you need to do, at this moment of crisis, you need to give and show this one act of fidelity to the Roman Empire. And once you have it, as far as we can tell, you're fine. They don't expire.
And as far as we know, that wasn't a money-making opportunity either. Did you have to buy one or pay somehow for your sacrifice?
No, well, it's just whatever the sacrifice itself was incense. So you come in, you put your fingers in the bowl and you throw it in the fire and you say what you have to say, and that's it. So it doesn't seem to be it's not a fundraising effort by the empire. It really is, let's figure out who's with us and who's against us. Let's make sure that everyone is being loyal to the empire, because if there are people who are not loyal to the empire, we need to know who they are. And this is the way that you really force people's hand to show which side they're on.
From a Christian perspective, though, and from the church perspective, doing it at all would have been forbidden, correct?
Yeah, so this is where we get into some of these issues. This is where it got confusing for people then. So let's take the example of the Apostle Paul's conversations about food sacrificed to idols. Can you eat food that's been sacrificed to an idol or not? And some of the Corinthians felt free to do that because they knew that the idols were not real gods. And some Christians' conscience did not allow them to do that. And so Paul's trying to negotiate that within the Corinthian community. Some saw it as an analogous situation. I can eat food sacrificed to idols because there are no idols. Therefore, I can make the sacrifice to the Roman gods because they're not real gods. Others didn't have the freedom to do that. So there are different approaches to this. The real problem, the rub on this, is when the different groups of people, those who have made the sacrifice, those who have paid for a sacrifice, those who've bribed Roman officials, along with maybe some of those who had been imprisoned or tortured, or who had family members imprisoned and tortured or dead, when they're all at church together on Sunday morning, that's when the problem really begins. And I think a way for us to think about this in our particular cultural moment, amid a lot of the controversies, maybe not so much in the part of the country where I live down here in the South, but many other parts of the country, the debates about meeting in person in church or not, and mask mandates, those are very live questions. So imagine going to church on a Sunday morning and a person is there whose spouse has died of COVID. And you have people in the room who are wearing masks and people in the room who aren't wearing masks. And you have the pro-vaccine people and the anti-vaccine people, and they're all there together. But this person has lost their spouse because of COVID. That can create, in fact, I know it creates tensions. I hear it from my friends who are pastors and priests, like, this is a real issue. That's what it was like for Cyprian. It's probably the best analogy. Now you have people looking at each other sideways and saying, wait a minute, how am I supposed to take the Eucharist? How you're taking Eucharist and you want me to take the Eucharist? You want me to drink from the same cup as you? You abandoned your faith. My son died in the arena. How are we supposed to share one cup? How are we supposed to be united as the body of Christ? And that is the pastoral issue that Cyprian really has to deal with.
Does that really develop into his issue
I think that's probably schism, and is in multiple ways. That is one of them. He ends up having multiple issues about church unity, but certainly with Cyprian, the ideas of church unity are central to his life and what he's trying to figure out. The persecution was difficult, and the plague was difficult, but in some sense, those were exterior to the community. This question about the response to persecution and what you do with people, they're called the lapsed, those who had lapsed in their faith. What do you do with those people? That becomes a very difficult issue for him, and one of the key issues of his time.
And now a word from our sponsors. And it seems like there's a lot of layers to this. There's the lapsed and the people who don't lapse, but you have somebody like Cyprian who just kind of skates away. And so he avoids the whole issue. But then you have people who have bought their libellus, which technically they didn't do anything, but they also didn't stand up. You have even on the people who refused to sacrifice, some of them actually were tortured, some of them were killed. Like you said, some of their families were killed. But then wasn't there an issue where some of the people, the martyrs and the ones who had not sacrificed and they were in some way punished, they're some of them are saying, we can't drink from the same cup. These people can't be around. But then there's other people saying, oh, come on, let's give them a break.
Right. Yes, this is a crisis of leadership, because ironically, some of the most forgiving people appear to be the confessors. These are people who are in prison still because they had refused to sacrifice. And so if the bishop, and it seems early on that Cyprian is not in a hurry to forgive people at all. So what other option do they have? They go to what they saw as another spiritual authority. And who has more spiritual authority than the confessors? So the confessors, according to the sources, began basically issuing these statements of forgiveness, saying, we, based on our spiritual authority, we forgive them. And if anybody should not forgive them, it's us. But we are going to say, we forgive you. And so now you have people coming back in saying, look, the confessors have forgiven me, and the bishop has not. And so as if you're Cyprian, you're trying to be sensitive to all parties here, but you certainly don't want to be seen. You can't be seen as being against the confessors because you're not against them, but in some ways they're also challenging your authority and your decisions. And so what Cyprian tries to do is skate a very, very sharp edge between these two sides. His work on unity, he starts off by praising the confessors and the martyrs, and then over the course of time begins laying out his own vision for the way that things should go. But he has to be, in some sense, he's disagreeing with some of them, but he can't be seen as antagonistic to them. He doesn't want to be antagonistic to them, but he wants proper church authority to be maintained. He doesn't want people to be forgiven too quickly and readmitted too quickly.
So in general, what did Cyprian want? Some avenue for forgiveness, or no forgiveness at all?
Yeah. So over time, this changes. And over time, what he develops is a possibility. He argues for the possibility of forgiveness before death. And there are some people who are more rigorous, who are saying, there's no forgiveness this side of death. Die, and then we'll see what God does with you. And Cyprian doesn't go that far, because in his mind, you basically have kicked people out of the church, and there's no unity there. So the question, the bigger question here is an individual person's sin, what I as a person in the community do, what the sins that I commit, are those a greater evil, or is the division of the body of Christ a greater evil? And that's part of the balance, what he's trying to say. And ultimately, he kind of comes down on the side of schism is a greater threat than individual sins. Individual failings cannot in and of themselves destroy the body of Christ, but schism can, which he sees as the work of the devil. So Satan wants to divide the church. Having us turn on each other is an easy way to do that. So it's a rigorous line. He's not just come on back, it's all good. He's not that way at all. But he does offer the possibility for repentance and forgiveness in this life.
I've read a little bit more about how things were going down in Rome. But so was the general spectrum, there was people who were, they lapsed, but were going to forgive them. under just normal circumstances, they'll do a penance, but it's not going to be an overly burdensome penance. To the opposite side of the spectrum, that, these people are out. Would you say that in that spectrum was Cyprian a sort of a third way for it, or was he just kind of on a little bit further on the spectrum towards the rigorous side, but just not quite to schism?
Right. Yeah, I think he's more toward that direction. The Roman Church, in the midst of this, is definitely more toward the forgiving side, and this is part of the tension between Cyprian and the Roman Church. Is that in general, the Roman Church had similar issues. They had people coming back who had lapsed, and they had a kind of a lower bar, I guess, for re-entry into the community, and that's a source of tension. At one point, even leading one of the Roman bishops to call Cyprian a heretic. So there was definite tension there. But Cyprian tended more toward the rigorous side. But for him, the overarching question is, how do I keep the Church of Christ as a body? How do I keep this together? And what I think in his own preferences, I think he's very, very rigorous. But as a pastor, he has to give up some of that for the sake of unity, which that happens sometimes in leadership, right? We may have very strong personal commitments, and sometimes we can try to impose those, but sometimes for the sake of unity, we have to let some of our personal preferences go in the cause of the greater unity. And that seems to be what Cyprian does. There's a bigger picture for him here than just the individual lapsed.
I think you brought up a really nice analogy in the book and was this something that they were talking about back then? The idea of the church being considered almost like a clean room where they make microchips and the place has to be absolutely spotless or else the whole thing falls apart, where other people are talking about the church as in a hospital where sick people go and you're treated to become better. Was that sort of were they using that analogy back then?
That's actually mine.
Oh, that's awesome. I like that.
Yeah, I was trying to explain this to students, but the totally different mentality. And I think that's on some level, Christians still wrestle with this in different places. So is the church a place for good people? Good people in quotes, right? Is the church a place where what we want on a Sunday morning and as we gather as a community, we want respectable people who are good people, who have their lives together, and we want to keep out the sinful world. So is the church like a clean room where everything should be spick and span? Or is the church like a hospital or an emergency room? Is it a place where the sick and the lame and the imperfect are welcome? What happens when I worship in a church that's in a center of the city, when homeless people wander in during a service? It's interesting to watch different reactions, people's visceral reaction to that. Well, is that what the church is like? So the lapse, these are people who are wounded. Now, in some cases, they brought their wounds on themselves, right? A drug addict who shows up at the ER, they brought this on some level, perhaps on themselves. But does the church still have a responsibility to care for them? Does a doctor have a responsibility to try to help a person who comes in, even if they've done something to put themselves in that situation? Or does the church say, we don't want you here? And that's ideologically, that's a lot of what Cyprian is dealing with. And I still think there are places in Christianity where we deal with this today. And so we sometimes move our churches into more respectable parts of town or out of town in the suburbs. And I think we sometimes struggle with this. And it points back to, it's a challenge for me, like anybody else. But I have to remember that it's pretty clear what Jesus's example was, that he was not primarily hanging out with the good people. He was hanging out with those that other people wanted nothing to do with. And I think that's what Cyprian ultimately decides, that to be the church, we need to be a place where the injured and the weak and the failed and the failing can come and be welcome.
Now, the layer 2 to your metaphor is whether so-called the doctor can be sick and still heal the patients. And that really hits right to the heart of Cyprian. Cyprian's someone who fled.
Yes.
And he didn't stand strong. So do the bishops and the priests who in some way were failing themselves, are they able to still carry on their duties? And that's kind of the next step.
It is. And it leads to the other major controversy, which is the rebaptism controversy. And so you have bishops or leaders who were lapsed or accused of being lapsed or had somehow some kind of moral failure, or were part of a group, maybe a schismatic group. So in Cyprian's case, you had Cyprian's church, but in Carthage, you also had people who were more lax, and they found their own bishop. And there were more rigorous people, and they found another person to lead them. And so if a person had been part of one of these other groups, let's say a part of the rigorous group, and then they wanted to come back and join Cyprian's church, if they were baptized by this other group, did that count or not? Did that baptism count in a schismatic group, or what some people would call a heretical group? And the underlying question there is, what makes a baptism valid? Which leads to the question of who's doing the baptism. And so part of the controversy was some people said if the bishop has moral failings, if the bishop is outside, is a schismatic or even a heretic worse, then they cannot baptize because the person doing the baptism has to be pure. The doctor has to be well in order for this to be effective. Versus those who would argue, no, baptism is ultimately a work of God. So God is doing the work. God is doing the healing. The physical person who's there, engaged in the physical act, they're not really doing the baptism. God's doing the baptism. So if they don't have to be perfect, or if a doctor has a cold and I show up at the ER and I'm having a heart attack, am I going to say, you know what, I really would rather wait for another doctor to come in who doesn't have a cold? Or am I going to say, you know what, do what you got to do, right? That's part of the, as you say, the second layer of this, and that leads to the rebaptism controversy with what to do with people who've been parts of other groups. And that will come up again in the Donatist controversy about a half century later, where the purity and legitimacy of the bishops is a central question. So does the person itself, do they have to, or is it God's work?
Before we get into the Donatist controversy and that next level or the next persecution, there were several popes of Rome who were from North Africa. What do we generally know about them and their biographies of how they got from North Africa and achieved the highest position in the capital city?
Yeah, so a lot of those biographies, we have maybe less complete information early on, but I think we could look at the career of someone like, I'll pull from someone later here, we could look at the career of someone like Augustine to see how this may have happened. Augustine's a North African, and we'll talk about him later, but he comes to Rome as a teacher of rhetoric initially, and then ends up in Milan, and then back in Rome for a time. Someone like Jerome, who ends up in Rome. There are people who come to Rome who already have certain qualities about them, and then they make a career there. And so for these North African church leaders to end up in Rome and then rise to the highest rank, it's similar to what we can see, I guess, in other people's careers, coming to Rome, rising to prominence. And at this time, if you were Italian, so to speak, or North African, you're both speaking Latin. There's probably not a ton of difference in terms of just your physical characteristics. And culturally speaking, Carthaginians were certainly different from Romans, but they took part in Romanness in the general sense. So there weren't some of the barriers there that we might imagine today between, eventually maybe a pope from Africa in the future of the Roman Catholic Church is a different situation from someone from Carthage coming to Rome in the 3rd century.
Now, moving forward about 50-ish years to the next set of persecutions, there's 50 years that are pretty good for Christians. They're not, the Christians are able to grow and make some big moves into the wider society. But then we have Diocletian who hits the stage, and he starts a major persecution. And probably most of the people who are listening here are fairly familiar with the Diocletian persecution. Were there any major differences in the way Diocletian's persecution was done as opposed to the earlier ones with Decius and a few others?
Yeah, so Diocletian was very organized, and this is the major difference. So with all the persecutions really leading up to Diocletian, we're talking about primarily localized and sporadic. With what's called the Great Persecution, the persecution of Diocletian, this is a much broader persecution. Now, so Diocletian separated the empire into 4 administrative units because he realized you can't really rule from Egypt to the British Isles. So he broke it into 4 administrative units, which means everything happened more efficiently, including the application of restrictions and penalties against Christians. Now, not all parts of the empire equally applied these restrictions, but North Africa is definitely a place that under Diocletian, they felt the sting of Roman persecution in a very particular way.
What were some of the things that were more severe in North Africa as opposed to throughout other parts of the empire?
Yeah, and this seems to be perhaps because of Diocletian's efficiency. The big thing Diocletian figured out, well, there are two things that he figured out. By the time he comes to power, there are a lot of Christians around. There are probably Christians in his imperial household. There are stories one of the stories says that he can see the church from his balcony. So he realizes that that Christians are very tied to their books and they're very tied to their leaders. And so part of his strategy with the Great Persecution is not to go after the little fish, not to chase every farmer and baker in town who doesn't want to sacrifice. No, go after the leaders. So he targets the bishops and the clergy, and he targets their books, thinking if he can get rid of their books and get rid of their leaders, then you'll strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. That seems to be his approach. And so when he hits hard, but he hits in key points, key pressure points, attempting really to fracture Christianity by getting rid of the leaders and the books. He doesn't maybe quite understand what's important about the books, but he knows that they're more than just books, that there's something about them that Christians are very dedicated to. And so those are the two areas that he targets specifically.
It's really, in a lot of ways, a brilliant strategy, but it doesn't quite work out entirely the way he planned it. How does he maybe fail?
Well, part of it is that there are some who simply refuse, right? So he runs up against this resistance. He runs up against bishops who are willing to die, some of them in quick succession. And so, which gives greater strength and greater resolve to other Christians. So the sheep don't actually scatter. Other shepherds rise up. And with the book situation, the people he's sending out to get these books aren't always, I guess, they weren't always first in their class at school. So they don't always necessarily even get Christian books. They get something else that looks like a Christian book. So the eradication of the texts themselves doesn't work. He can't ultimately fracture the communities by killing the bishop because it's almost like you kill one and two rise up. So it doesn't work out the way he wants. He tries to intimidate, really, Christians into submission, and he finds their resolve is much, much deeper than he had anticipated. And eventually, over time, he finally basically kind of gives up on the idea and decides this has not worked. So when he really begins to back off, there are still places in the East. One of his sub-emperors, a guy named Galerius, is not ready to give up yet. And he continues the persecution of Christians in parts of the East much after it's stopped in large parts of the West. But for a while, Diocletian is quite convinced about this and does everything he can to make it successful, but ultimately he can't enforce it.
So fast forwarding a few years, Constantine takes over. He makes Christianity legal. He eventually becomes a Christian himself, but it's not one big happy family after here. A lot of those problems that had come up during the Decian persecution are even more severe now. And we enter maybe a rigorous versus leniency 2.0. What did that look like after this second really major persecution?
Yeah, so you have the death of a bishop of Carthage, and so there's an election to replace him. And there's an official election, and someone is elected. A guy named Caecilian is elected to replace him as the bishop. However, there are questions about him, and there are questions about his fitness, not physical fitness, but his theological fitness, because he's accused of being in the line he's accused of having been ordained by a bishop who had handed over Christian books. And because he had handed over Christian books, he was considered what they called a traditor. It gives us the word traitor, but it's not a one-to-one correspondence. Traditor literally means ones who handed over something. He had handed over books. So this person had allegedly handed over books. Therefore, at that point, in some people's eyes, he was no longer a bishop. Later, that person laid hands on Caecilian to ordain him as a priest. But if he was no longer a legitimate bishop, then Caecilian was never a legitimate priest, and so he cannot be the bishop. And so there's this kind of, it's kind of a canonical law argument, but what happens is another group springs up and says, we are going to elect a legitimate bishop. And so in North Africa, you end up with two different bishops in Carthage, and then this split spreads throughout large parts of North Africa, and you end up with two rival church hierarchies at the same time in the same places. And it's called the Donatist controversy because in the kind of the resisting group, you could say, Donatus, a guy named Donatus, is their second bishop. And so it's named for him, the Donatist controversy, named for Donatus. and you end up with rival church hierarchies. Constantine doesn't like this. Constantine is, with all due respect to Eusebius, the historian, Constantine was not a great theologian. In his mind, what you have is, okay, we have a church now that's worshiping God. If we don't have a unified church, God could get angry and then God could punish us. We need to have a unified church. He looks at the situation in North Africa, and what he sees is a divided church. This is a threat to the empire. So he follows the lead of the Bishop of Rome, who sides with Caecilian and that side. And they call themselves the Catholics. By the way, the Donatists also called themselves the Catholics because they both argued that they were legitimate. But Constantine sides with one side of the debate, ends up sending troops. There's some violence involved and an attempt to enforce, I guess, people getting back in line under one true bishop. And Constantine never manages to solve this problem.
And now a word from our sponsors. During this whole time period, the Caecilianists, they're the official church with Roman government backing.
Yes.
Did that completely drive the Donatists underground, or were they able to be above ground in some circumstances?
Yeah, they were above ground. Yeah, and in many ways, it would appear that the majority of Christians in North Africa followed the Donatists. So you had, and there's an old theory that the Caecilianists were in the cities and the Donatists were just the country folk, but that's not true. We know that there were churches in major cities as well. But certainly when you got outside Carthage, you got into other parts of Numidia and Mauritania, you had the bishops out there were almost all more Donatist. They were definitely more rigorous. And it goes back to the question of the ordination of Caecilian and the laying on of hands of Caecilian by a bishop who supposedly had been illegitimate. So when a priest is ordained, who's doing the ordination? Is the bishop ordaining him, or is God ordaining him? Like with baptism, it's a similar question, right? Just with a different application. And so in North Africa, you had this split between those who said bishops who are no longer legitimate and all the bishops who follow in their line, they're all illegitimate. They're all out. We need to find a pure line of bishops who have never abandoned the faith. And that's really at the heart of the Donatist controversy.
Was there also maybe a political element to it? Because couldn't they have just, if everybody thought Caecilian was a decent bishop, couldn't they have somehow canonically got him squared away and gone forward?
Yeah, they could have. And I think with the stories about the bishop who the bishop who did ordain him, supposedly being a traditor, a traitor, basically, it's very unclear that this ever actually happened. And what could be behind this, on some level, could be anti-Roman sentiment that for some North Africans goes back to the time of Cyprian, when Cyprian here's what the North African church is going to do, and you had a sharp controversy between Cyprian and the Roman church over this. And some North Africans never got over that. And that could be cropping up again. It could be some anti-Roman sentiment. And think about it this way too, it's until this time had been very dangerous for Christians in the Roman Empire. And now suddenly overnight with Constantine, are things totally different? And then Constantine sends troops. And for some on the Donatist side, this is the proof, okay, wait, this is just business as usual. He may be claiming to be a Christian and he may claim that these are bishops, but now we see he is supporting a line of illegitimate bishops. This is Roman persecution 4.0 or 5.0 or 6, whatever number we're at by then. This is the same old thing over and over again. And so they dug in their heels because in their minds, they were in the same situation as Cyprian and those under Vespasian and those under Nero. They were in the same situation.
Generally speaking, the Donatists and the Caecilians, they're two churches. They could be right next door to each other. Over the course of time, did they diverge in practice, or did they stay pretty much in parallel?
There's nothing to indicate that there was anything about their practice that was different. We don't have any indication that the liturgy was different. There's one indication in one text that perhaps the Donatists may have painted the insides of their churches white, perhaps. But beyond that, there's really nothing that separated them. The liturgies seem to be the same. We have, in fact, some of the later texts, some of the later anti-Donatist texts, and including the writings of Augustine, where he says things like they claim to honor the apostles Peter and Paul the way that we do, but their song's illegitimate. It's not that their song is different or they're singing a different song. It's that their song is illegitimate. So there, as far as we can tell, there's really nothing distinctive about practices. And in terms of overall theology, we can't really tell a difference in overall theology. We don't have the information that suggests that. It seems to be more rigorous, less rigorous. They both claim to be the legitimate church. So that's where the debate over the martyrs comes into play. Both sides claiming that they are in the line of the legitimate martyrs, which goes back to the apostles. And so if their martyrs go back to Peter and Paul, they are the true church. And the other church is the false church of Satan. And they both seem to feel that way about each other at different points.
Zipping forward about 100-ish years, we get to Augustine, who they're still fighting out these controversies between the Donatists and the Caecilians. Had they reached, was it really just a paper argument, or throughout time was there violence between the groups?
There were indications of times of violence going into the middle of the 4th century. There are certain famous cases of violence. And even in Augustine's time, there are Donatists, because he refers to the fact in one of his sermons that they can hear Donatists singing from his church. So they're still around. The question, how does this ever get resolved? One of the leading theories is that it only gets resolved when the Vandals invade North Africa, the barbarian Vandals, who many of whom were probably Arians, that the problem is never resolved, except that maybe at some point the exterior threat becomes greater than the interior threat. And that seems to be maybe what doesn't solve the Donatist controversy. What ends the Donatist controversy is actually the Vandal invasions of North Africa.
Somebody like Augustine, he lives in one of those times where he saw so much change, where you go from a Roman Empire that's pretty much the Roman Empire that had been around for a long time, to his hometown is sacked on his deathbed, and it's taken over by these Vandals. What were the major issues that occupied him during his lifetime?
Yeah, so Augustine's a fascinating character, and if anyone listening, if you've never read the Confession, Augustine's Confessions, I highly recommend them to you. It's considered by most scholars the first work of Western introspective autobiography, and it's a story of his youth and his complicated relationship with his parents. So read it. Now, when you get to the last couple of books, Augustine turns to his interpretation of the first chapters of Genesis, and he goes into a lot of allegory and things that can get a little thick. But the autobiographical part, I highly recommend. Augustine, as you mentioned, he's born in 354. 380 is when Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. It's legal under Constantine, but it's Theodosius I who makes it the official religion of the empire in 380. So he sees that dramatic change. And for Augustine, someone who wants no part of the church when he's young and has this dramatic and kind of famous conversion experience, doesn't want part in public life, goes away and founds a monastery because he wants to get away, but he keeps getting pulled into public life. And with Augustine, his work touches on so many areas of Christian thought. And I guess maybe two that I'll mention of two different types. One is his work, The City of God, which is written after the sack of Rome in 410. And the question that he's addressing is, if God favors Rome, and if, as they believed at that time, if the martyrs were protecting Rome, if the bones of Peter and Paul were protecting Rome, how could Rome possibly fall? And Augustine basically says, you've misunderstood the city of God. The city of God is not a physical place. There's the city of God above, and that's what the real city of God is. So it's really a corrective to those in his mind who had tried to create the kingdom of God in kind of a literal way on earth, that it was never the way it was. You've always missed the point, he said. And which is a really interesting commentary. I mean, even coming down to our day today, where there are different approaches to the connection between religion and politics. And in certain parts of our society, we see people who really want to create this country as a Christian country, and in some ways create the kingdom of God. And Augustine's work is maybe what might cause us to rethink that approach. Can we ever create the kingdom of God on earth fully? Augustine seemed to think that no, we can't. The other big question is his debate with Pelagius, and over the nature of God, but more so over the nature of anthropology, over the nature of the human condition, and what is God's role in salvation and what is our role in salvation or not. And this pulls in the doctrine of original sin, and he finds himself in a debate with Pelagius, who Pelagius didn't believe that God had no role in it. Pelagius believed that God gave human beings the ability to be perfect, but we had to have the will to make it happen, and we had to make it happen. And Pelagius believed that we could. Pelagius believed that through self-discipline, we could actually be perfect in the eyes of God. And Augustine just fundamentally disagreed with that. And that's the debate they have. And so original sin plays a part in this. Like Augustine says, no, we don't have the will to be good. We can't bring about doing good because we don't even have that will, because our will is fundamentally broken and fundamentally flawed. And this is really the debate. What's the nature of grace? For Pelagius, grace is God gives us all the parameters we need. He gives us the example of Christ. He gives us the scriptures. He gives us the prophets. He points us in the right direction, and he gives us a shove, and he says, okay, now go make it happen. That's grace for Pelagius. Versus Augustine, who says, we're dead. We can't go in the right direction. We're dead. Grace brings us from death to life, and nothing actually can happen without a move of God. And it becomes a very heated debate between these two sides. And over time, they both kind of seem to move out to farther away from each other on the spectrum rather than coming closer together towards some kind of agreement or compromise.
And that really ends this book that you wrote, that it's really Augustine is the last chapter, so to speak, that you write about. But Christianity, they have to deal with the Vandals and their own brand of Christianity that they bring. And then ultimately Islam comes approximately 150-ish, 200 years after this. For the first question, do you plan on writing that next book about what happens next, the sequel?
Well, the challenge, the challenge with there are people who do very good work on this, and that would go. It's a book that I guess I could certainly do the research into it. It's the Vandal period is notoriously difficult in terms of figuring out what the reality was, because some of the sources, there's a lot of debate about how to interpret the sources. Where do the Vandals fit into the story, I guess, even kind of theologically? And then once Islam comes, certainly it's a catastrophic change for this part of the world. And so it's that bridge area where honestly not a lot of people do a lot of work because it's hard. So it's something I might think about. I think there are other topics that I'm sort of curious about as well. But Augustine's probably the last figure of antiquity, at least as it relates to this part of the world, because he is still, we can see him as a clearly identifiable Roman, culturally speaking. He's really, a lot of his work and his thinking is in continuity with the Roman world that had come before him, which is largely overturned and destroyed in large part by the Vandals, who bring in an entirely different and new chapter in the history of North Africa. And then, of course, again, as you say, not long after that, when the armies of Islam arrive in the 7th century, again, that's a total overturning of the tables in a way that this region of the world has never been the same.
And it really, a lot of the evidence shows that Christianity died out really quickly after the armies of Islam came. What does the modern scholarship show and think about that changeover and how it happened?
Well, so I will describe as honestly as I can what the sources describe. And this gets tricky sometimes now because I want to be careful. I don't want to seem like I'm targeting anyone. But the reality is the sources seem to indicate to us that when the armies of Islam arrive, Christians are people of the book. So Muslims do see some kind of distant family relationship, although Islamic theology says that Christianity is a distortion of the true religion of Abraham. So they're distant cousins. So they do get treated differently from just, say, the run-of-the-mill pagan. But you have the option to convert to Islam. You have the option to pay the tax, the Christian tax or the infidel tax, or you have the option to die. And on the face of it, we might say, well, a lot of Christians, by the way, seem to convert. And you think, well, wow, paying a tax doesn't sound too bad. Well, it seems that the tax was about 75% of your income. It's a pretty significant amount of money, which a lot of people in this time are still living really kind of day to day, not easily accessible. Some do choose to die, but some maybe do go through this kind of forced conversion that takes Christianity out in large part across this part of Africa. although not as much in Egypt. Egypt has deeper roots there, and with the kind of I think the geographical diversity of Egypt plays a part there. So Christianity, it survives in North Africa for a while, but certainly it's negatively impacted with the armies of Islam and a different. It was not, hey, would you like to convert? It was not that kind of model. It was a much more enforced, I guess, in the way that there are parts of Christian tradition where, if you look at what happened to maybe Jews in Spain during the Inquisition, a similar kind of approach that had devastating effects for the Jewish population of Spain. Same thing for the Christian population of North Africa.
So with those carrots and sticks, it could happen really quickly.
Yes, it seems to have happened in large numbers. And certainly it seemed probably in the countryside, maybe people were a little more protected from this, but the major population centers seems to be more easily dealt with.
And maybe just to wrap up today, what are some things that you're researching right now that are really interesting to you?
Well, I've been reading some things recently about Ignatius of Antioch, 2nd century bishop and martyr, and thinking more about the way that he is remembered and talked about in later texts. Because Ignatius is a person who is seen in different ways. He's seen as in some cases as kind of the first person we can really point to and say, there's a person historically who was the single bishop of a city. And he has some very strong arguments about the authority of bishops and clergy and the layout, the administrative bishops and deacons. And that's one of the lenses that he's viewed through. He's also a martyr and a letter writer. So that's another primary way of looking at him. But I've been reading some things just this week, in fact, about looking at Ignatius as a person living under empire and how he himself, the Romans would say that he submitted to the empire because he died. But actually what Ignatius did by going to his death was he defeated the empire, and kind of rethinking the way that we think of martyrdom as victory for the martyr themselves. They go into the presence of God. They have been victorious, but thinking more broadly about the way in which this was actually a victory for Christianity as a whole. How is Christianity as a whole victorious in these periods of persecution over the Roman Empire? And a lot of it comes down to the fact when they take everything they can take away from you, but you hold on to your faith. What else can they take? What else is there to take? And you ultimately win. When you have nothing to lose, you win.